I've always believed that the most dangerous monsters are the ones that don't show their faces. You can prepare yourself for a shadow in an alleyway, for footsteps following you at night, for a stranger lurking behind you. That kind of fear is familiar, almost predictable. But what I learned in this case was that the most terrifying threat can come disguised as a simple vibration in your pocket, a glowing screen, a number you've never seen before. And when that number becomes a voice, and that voice becomes an obsession, everything you thought you understood about safety begins to slip away. I'm Detective Miller Files, and this is where the story begins. It was a foggy morning when I received the call from the district liaison assigned to juvenile cyber cases. His tone carried a tension that I've learned to recognize over the years. It's the sound of someone who has just realized the problem they're holding is bigger than they initially thought. He told me there was a high school student who had been receiving persistent messages from an unknown number. At first glance, it looked like a minor case, the sort of thing guidance counselors and parents usually handled. But then came the escalation. The messages turned obsessive, intrusive, and increasingly threatening. That was when he decided to bring me in. I arrived at the school later that day. The halls felt like any other place where teenagers grew up too fast. Lockers slammed shut. Sneakers squeaked across the linoleum. Laughter echoed through crowded hallways. Yet beneath that sense of youthful chaos, I could feel something else. An anxiety that lingered without form, like a shadow that hadn't yet decided whom it belonged to. The student, whom I'll call A for privacy, was waiting in a small administrative office. A's hands trembled slightly as I sat down across from them. I've seen that look before, a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and fear. Victims of digital harassment often blame themselves before they blame the perpetrator. They convince themselves they should have known better, should have acted differently, should never have replied. But the truth is, predators thrive on the moments when vulnerability disguises itself as curiosity. I told me everything began with a single message, a simple line, "Hey, I think we go to the same school." That was all it took, one small spark that would grow into a wildfire. At first, the conversation felt harmless. I thought it might be a shy classmate or someone who had seen them around campus. The messages were polite, even sweet at times. I didn't feel threatened. In fact, A admitted something I've heard many times before. It felt nice to be noticed. Teenagers crave connection, especially the kind that feels secret and exciting. A hidden admirer, an anonymous voice, a mystery waiting to be solved. For A, it felt like a harmless adventure. But as the days passed, the tone shifted. The messages grew more personal, more specific, more intimate. It told me the sender seemed to know things they shouldn't. It began with simple observations like what A wore that day, or who A had spoken to. But soon the unknown number described exact moments that happened only minutes earlier. A drop of a backpack, a glance exchanged in the hallway, a conversation whispered at a locker. To an investigator, that kind of detail is a flare in the night sky. It means one thing: the perpetrator is not far away. They are watching, they are close. I tried to ignore the unease, hoping the situation would blow over. But paranoia has a way of tightening around the mind like a web. They told me that by the third day of messages, they couldn't walk through the halls without wondering if every set of eyes belonged to the person behind the screen. Every corner felt like it held a hidden witness. Every whisper sounded like it might be about them. I asked A to hand me the phone. I scrolled through the messages, reading them not as words, but as patterns. The cadence, the shifts in mood, the calculated balance between affection and control. This wasn't random. This wasn't a prank. This was someone who understood manipulation, someone who wanted isolated, confused, and emotionally dependent, someone who understood the psychology of closeness. Then I reached the message that changed everything. "You looked beautiful today. the way you laughed during third period. I couldn't stop staring. I froze when I read it aloud. Third period had taken place inside a classroom with no windows facing the hallway. Only people inside the room could have witnessed that moment. And A had not laughed loudly. It was a quiet laugh during a brief exchange with a friend, the kind that should have gone unnoticed. That was when I realized we weren't dealing with someone guessing or checking social media stories. The perpetrator had been physically present, maybe only a few feet away. This changed the nature of the investigation entirely. There is a moment in every investigation when the ground beneath you shifts, when the details that once seemed mundane twist suddenly into something sharp. For me, that moment arrived the second I realized the perpetrator had been physically close to A during third period. Close enough to watch. Close enough to notice the kind of laugh that wouldn't be heard outside the room. The kind of detail that sinks into your stomach and makes you understand that what you're facing isn't just a case of digital manipulation, but something that has already crossed into the physical world. After leaving the school that afternoon, I sat in my car for a long moment, replaying every message in my mind. I've spent years profiling digital aggressors, and there's a particular pattern in cases where cyber obsession bleeds into real-world fixation. The messages grow increasingly intimate, the boundaries increasingly blurred, and the sense of proximity becomes unmistakable. In this case, the signs were flashing neon red. I drove to A's home later that evening to speak with the parents. They opened the door with a mix of exhaustion and dread in their eyes. They had already read enough of the messages to understand that the situation was no longer harmless. I sat silently on the couch, knees pulled close, eyes staring at a spot on the carpet, as though the right pattern might reveal the identity of the stranger behind the screen. I asked A to walk me through the entire timeline again, not because I doubted the account, but because details often surface when the mind retraces its steps. As A spoke, I watched the subtle shifts in expression, the pauses, the moments when fear crept up their spine and made them swallow before continuing. Those small breaks often reveal more than words themselves. A explained that the number always texted at roughly the same times each day, moments that coincided with school breaks or after-school transitions. Rarely late at night, rarely early in the morning. Whoever was sending these messages lived a schedule parallel to A's. A rhythm aligned not with a stranger drifting online at random hours, but with someone whose life moved inside the same walls, the same halls, the same lunch periods. The type of person who could watch without being seen. I asked A if there had been anyone recently who seemed to pay extra attention to them. A shook their head at first, then hesitated. It was that hesitation I leaned into. There's always someone who watched too long, someone who lingered by a locker, someone whose gaze felt heavier than it should have. I finally mentioned a student from a year above, someone who had approached A once with clumsy friendliness, but never pushed further. Nothing alarming on the surface, yet a one-time interaction is all some people need to build an entire fantasy. Night had settled by the time I left A's home. The streets were quiet houses lined up in perfect rows, each window glowing softly with the illusion of safety. I drove slowly, watching silhouettes move behind curtains, each one a reminder that the person we were looking for could be any of them, not a shadow in an alley, not a masked figure, just another teenager. Another face blending into the sea of ordinary. When I returned to my office, I began analyzing the text patterns more thoroughly. The linguistic style was calculated and measured. The perpetrator wrote with a fluency that suggested someone young but articulate. They alternated between affection and insecurity, between confidence and desperation. This oscillation was a classic sign of someone attempting to craft a persona they themselves did not fully embody. The digital mask was slipping even if they didn't realize it. The next message arrived the following morning, time-stamped at 7:43 a.m., just 17 minutes before the school bell. I forwarded it to me immediately. The message read, "I saw you walk in today. You're quieter than usual. Did I do something wrong?" I stared at the screen and felt the weight of the situation deepen. The school entrance at that hour was crowded a river of backpacks and half-awake teenagers. For someone to pinpoint A's demeanor amid the chaos meant one thing: the perpetrator had been watching, deliberately searching for them among the crowds like a hawk scanning fields for movement. This wasn't coincidence anymore. This was surveillance. I headed straight to the school and positioned myself near the entrance. Students streamed past me in waves, laughing, shoving each other, barely noticing the detective in a worn coat leaning against a column. I watched the faces not for guilt, but for fixation. Most eyes drifted past A without pause, but a few lingered, some with curiosity, some with something else, something heavier. Observing a high school hallway is like watching an entire ecosystem compressed into a single structure. There are hierarchies, currents, unspoken rules. And within that system, obsession can grow unnoticed, feeding quietly in the dark corners of adolescent insecurity. I asked the administration for access to hallway camera footage from the previous week. Nearly all high schools have security cameras now, but they rarely capture what matters most: intent. Still, sometimes patterns emerge. Humans are creatures of routine, especially those who linger where they should not. Later, reviewing the footage frame by frame, I saw A walking to class as usual. Nothing unusual on the surface. But then I noticed a figure consistently appearing within the same corridors, always at a distance, always just close enough to watch without engaging. The face was blurry, the camera resolution too low to identify them clearly, but the posture was unmistakable. Shoulders slightly hunched forward, head tilted as though listening to footsteps rather than voices. Someone who moved with purpose but not confidence. Someone building an obsession step by step. This investigation was no longer just about tracing a number. It had become a hunt for a presence hiding in plain sight. There is a particular silence that hangs in the air when the truth begins to take shape. It is not loud, not dramatic, but a slow tightening of the world around you, as though every breath begins to sound different. That was the silence that settled over me as I watched the blurry figure in the hallway footage. Shadow A from a distance. I didn't have a face. I didn't have a name. But I had movement. And movement tells a story long before a suspect ever speaks. The next morning I returned to the school early. Dawn had barely touched the sky, yet the parking lot was already beginning to fill with staff cars. The building looked harmless in the pale early light, an ordinary school sheltering ordinary lives. But inside those walls was someone who had crossed a boundary so quietly that no one had noticed until the illusion of safety began to crack. I met with the assistant principal, who escorted me to a small security room tucked behind the administrative office. The space smelled of dust and old wires, the kind of room forgotten until someone needed the ghosts it recorded. We pulled the footage from earlier dates, expanding the radius of our search. If someone had been watching A, they had likely been doing so long before the texts began. Hours passed as I watched grainy scenes flicker across the monitors. Students rushing between classes, teachers carrying stacks of papers, custodians pushing carts, hallways that shifted in density like waves. Yet through the endless motion, I kept noticing the same body language from the same shape. Always near the edges of the frame, always turning away just enough to avoid revealing too much. always positioned where A would eventually walk. Patterns reveal themselves to those patient enough to watch without expectation. And this pattern was emerging with frightening clarity. I asked the administration for class rosters and hallway schedules. Not to accuse anyone, but to understand possible pathways. Who could physically be in those hallways at those times? Who would logically match the timing, the angles, the presence? High schools are rigid structures. Movement is not truly free even when it feels chaotic. Bells dictate behavior. Footpaths repeat. Students become predictable without realizing it. But predators who hide within routine rely on the same predictability. While cross-checking schedules, I received a text from A. The hands must have been shaking when they typed it because the message came in uneven bursts. The unknown number had texted again. Not just once, multiple times. The first message read, "I miss you. You passed right by me today." Another arrived seconds later. "You didn't even notice me." And then the third. "Do I matter that little to you?" I closed my eyes for a moment. I had seen this progression before. Not just in online cases, but in stalker behavior. The shift from observation to emotional demand signaled a change in the perpetrator's internal state. No longer content to watch from afar, they wanted acknowledgement. They wanted validation, and validation denied becomes fuel for desperation. I returned to the security footage from that morning. I had indeed passed through the hallway at the expected time. Students swarmed around them in the usual morning chaos. But then, just as the camera swept its slow arc, I saw a shape step back into a corner as A walked by. The head lowered. The shoulders tightened, as though the person feared being recognized, but could not resist being close. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was enough. That kind of reaction wasn't random. It was emotional. It was personal. I paused the footage and leaned closer. The face was still too blurry to distinguish, but the hairstyle, the build, the height, all offered clues. A male adolescent, medium height, slightly leaning posture, hair falling forward. I replayed several past clips, comparing carefully. The behavior matched. The silhouette was consistent, the same strange blend of longing and avoidance. As I analyzed the footage, A called me. Their voice was thin, almost trembling. They told me the unknown number had stopped texting abruptly after the emotional burst, as though retreating into silence. But silence from a stalker is never comfort. It is the inhale before the next move. I told A to stay with friends during transitions between classes, to avoid walking alone, and to report any unfamiliar presence. Not because I wanted A living in fear, but because awareness itself can disrupt the patterns predators rely on. They crave invisibility. When the world suddenly turns to look at them, the illusion breaks. Later in the afternoon, I positioned myself near the courtyard that students crossed between buildings. It was a wide area, open and bright, offering no easy places to hide. I wanted to see who watched A when hiding became difficult. I stepped into the courtyard with 2 friends laughing faintly, though the tension in their shoulders betrayed the effort. I scanned the groups around them. Teenagers in clusters, some absorbed in phones, some tossing backpacks, some running to beat the bell. Normal, natural. But then I saw him. A figure standing alone near a tree. Not interacting, not talking, not pretending to be part of any group. His eyes were not on his phone, or on the sky, or on friends. His eyes were on A. It was a stare that didn't wander. A stare so focused that anyone looking closely would feel the intent behind it like a pulse. I watched him carefully. He didn't move toward A. He didn't smile or frown. He simply watched, absorbing every gesture like a starving mind, clinging to the only thing that fed it. This was no longer a nameless presence on a camera feed. This was someone real. Someone inches away from crossing another line. Someone who believed they had a relationship with A that existed only in their own mind. And that belief was the most dangerous part of all. There is a point in every investigation when the difference between watching and acting becomes dangerously thin. The boy who stood beneath that tree, the one whose eyes clung to A as though tethered by an invisible thread, had not yet crossed that line. But obsession rarely stays still. It grows. It festers. It waits for the moment when desperation convinces itself that it has nothing left to lose. As I watched him watching A, I knew we were approaching that moment. That afternoon I stayed on campus longer than usual, drifting through the halls while pretending to be absorbed in my notes. Students moved like flocks, their conversations rising and falling in unpredictable currents. Every now and then I felt the strange ripple that comes when someone tries too hard to blend in. It wasn't always the same person. Teenagers are full of secrets and insecurities, and many of them move through the world as if afraid of being seen. But only one among them watched A with a hunger strong enough to eclipse every other emotion. When the final bell rang, the courtyard flooded with students racing toward freedom. I walked with two friends glancing nervously over their shoulder. I followed at a careful distance, trying not to disrupt the natural flow of the environment. The boy I had seen earlier was nowhere in sight. But absence has never comforted me. Sometimes the most dangerous moments come when the predator pulls back to think. Back in my office that evening, I spread out printouts of the hallway footage, arranging them chronologically. The images formed a timeline of presence without identity, a ghost walking just behind A's shadow. On one sheet, he lingered near a vending machine. On another, he paused at the end of a locker row. On several, he stopped moving entirely whenever A came into view, as though the world itself froze with him. But it was the spacing that drew my attention. He never came too close, never risked proximity beyond a certain invisible radius. This wasn't impulsivity. It was restraint. Restraint meant planning. Planning meant escalation. Before I could go deeper into the analysis, my phone buzzed. A had forwarded another message from the unknown number. This one was different, stripped of the earlier sweetness, carrying a tone that felt colder and more fractured. You feel distant today. I don't know why you're avoiding me. Another came seconds later. I'm trying to be patient with you. Then a third. I see how you look at others. Don't forget who really cares. It was the final message, however, that settled into my chest like a weight. You can't ignore me forever. The phrasing was deceptively simple, but hidden beneath it was a shift in psychological control. This wasn't just longing anymore. This was entitlement. The belief that A owed him something, and that belief could turn volatile fast. I arranged the messages in the timeline alongside the footage. Each surge of emotional intensity from the unknown number coincided with moments when the boy appeared on camera, with a posture that tightened, or when he moved closer than before. The digital voice and the physical shadow were merging. The next day, I arrived at school with a different approach. Instead of observing from afar, I positioned myself within the flow of students. Predators often act differently when the environment bends out of its normal rhythm. A sudden shift in attention, a new adult presence where none had been before, can cause them to falter, and faltering reveals intent. I walked past with their friend's shoulders noticeably tense but trying to carry on. I scanned the courtyard, the benches, the walkway near the tree. Then I saw him again. This time he stood closer, not by much, but enough to signal the change. His eyes locked onto A with a sharpness that cut through the morning noise. He lifted his phone, pretending to scroll, but his gaze lingered too long to pass as casual. I stepped toward him. Not enough to confront, just enough to disturb the illusion that he was unseen. His body stiffened. He lowered his phone. For a moment, he looked like a child caught stealing something intangible. Then he turned away, abruptly, and walked toward the north hall. I followed at a distance. He moved with the same uneven gait I had seen on the footage. Shoulders hunched forward, hands nervously brushing the sides of his pockets. Several times he slowed down near reflective surfaces, not to check his appearance, but to observe the hallway behind him. He was making sure A wasn't approaching, or perhaps making sure I wasn't. The hall narrowed near a stairwell, and he slipped inside. I waited before entering, giving him the illusion of solitude. When I finally stepped into the stairwell, I saw him sitting on the top step, elbows resting on his knees, head bowed. He wasn't looking at his phone anymore. He was simply staring at the floor, breathing heavily. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I approached slowly, careful not to startle him. When I spoke, my voice was calm. "I saw you in the courtyard earlier." He flinched but didn't run. That alone told me he was near a breaking point. Running requires clarity. He didn't have that. "I know you've been watching," AI continued. "We need to talk about it." His head snapped up, and for the first time I saw his eyes. They were not cold, not calculating. They were terrified. But terror doesn't make someone harmless. Terror makes them unpredictable. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I waited. Silence filled the stairwell, heavy and unsteady. Finally, he whispered something so quiet I had to lean in to hear it. I didn't mean to scare them. People always say that, even when the fear they create becomes the only language they understand. But then he added something else, something that chilled the air between us. I just wanted them to talk to me. They won't talk to me anymore in real life. In real life. The distinction mattered, more than he realized, because it meant he and A had a history, and history leaves footprints. When a confession begins to surface, it rarely arrives as a clear and complete truth. It comes fractured, hesitant, trembling between guilt and longing. The boy sitting on the stairwell, shoulders collapsing inward, as though trying to disappear, had not intended to reveal anything. But the moment he referenced real life, the moment he acknowledged a history with A, the final veil of anonymity began to fall. I watched him carefully. Every movement, every breath, every flicker in his eyes told me he was on the edge of something unstable. Not violence necessarily, but collapse. A psychological unraveling brought on by the weight of an obsession he no longer knew how to hold. I asked him to tell me what he meant. He swallowed hard, gripping the hem of his sleeve so tightly his knuckles whitened. "They used to talk to me," he whispered. "Last year. We had a class together." His voice cracked, revealing the fragility beneath his words. I remained silent, allowing the space to pull more truth from him. "They were kind to me. Not like others. They said my project was good. No one ever says that. No one ever notices me." There it was. The catalyst. A small kindness amplified in the mind of someone starving for recognition. A single moment turned into a foundation for fantasy. His gaze drifted upward, unfocused, as though replaying scenes only he remembered. But this year, he continued, "They don't even look at me. They walk past me like I'm nothing." I waited. I tried to say hi. They didn't hear me. Or maybe they ignored me. I don't know. He rubbed his hands together anxiously, the friction a desperate attempt to anchor himself. I just wanted to remind them I existed. In another context, his words might have inspired sympathy. But obsession turns longing into entitlement, and entitlement into intrusion. I asked him how long he had been watching A. His breathing hitched. He admitted he didn't remember exactly, that it started as curiosity, then became attention, then became routine, and eventually necessity. I felt close to them when I texted, he said. Closer than in real life. They told me things. They trusted me. I asked how he knew those things, how he could describe details of A's day or moments inside specific classrooms. His eyes darted away in panic before he finally admitted he had been entering classrooms during breaks. Sometimes before school started, sometimes lingering near open doors, pretending to look for a lost item. I just listened, he said. I didn't mean harm. I just wanted to feel connected again. The weight of his delusion pressed against the walls of the stairwell. I could feel how real the imaginary relationship had become to him, how the line between observation and participation had blurred until he no longer knew which world he belonged to. Then came the moment that chilled me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. Not his main phone, but a second one. Small, cheap, prepaid, disposable. This is the number, he said quietly, the one I used. The air shifted. I took the phone, carefully holding it as though it were a piece of evidence made from glass. Inside it lay every message he had ever sent to A, every plea, every demand, every threat disguised as affection, but it was what he said next that revealed the full magnitude of his spiral. I wasn't going to hurt them, he whispered. I just thought if they were scared, maybe they'd talk to me again. Just once, just to see me. This statement, more than anything else, revealed the danger. Not because he intended harm, but because he did not understand harm. Fear had become in his mind a form of communication, a bridge, a last resort for a connection he felt slipping away. I asked him why the messages had become darker, more demanding. His expression crumpled. Because they stopped answering, he said. When someone disappears, you do whatever it takes to make them hear you. The simplicity of his explanation made it all the more unsettling. This was not the mind of a calculating predator. This was the mind of someone who had built an entire emotional reality out of assumption and silence. Someone who believed intimacy could be forged unilaterally. Someone who did not understand that affection without consent becomes coercion. At that moment, footsteps echoed down the hallway beyond the stairwell. Students transitioning between classes, laughter, a locker slamming shut, ordinary sounds of ordinary lives. But the boy flinched, shrinking inward. Are you going to tell them? He asked, voice shaking. Are they going to hate me? I did not answer right away. Justice is not always clean. It does not always come wrapped in punishment. Sometimes justice is intervention. Sometimes it is prevention. Sometimes it is the shield placed between two people whose worlds have collided in the wrong way. No one hates you, I said slowly, but this has to stop. It stops today. His eyes filled with tears not from remorse alone, but from the collapse of a fantasy he had clung to for far too long, a fantasy he believed was real, a fantasy he believed A shared. As I escorted him from the stairwell, his steps were small and hesitant, like someone walking away from the only world they had known. But the truth was waiting outside that stairwell, and the truth, once revealed, never returns to silence.